Hi, everybody. My name is Denis Pennel. I'm the Managing Director of the World Employment Confederation, and I'm very happy today to welcome Stefano Scarpetta, Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs from the OECD. Hello to you, Stefano.
Hello, Denis. Great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Same from our side. So we would like to follow up on the annual conference that the World Employment Confederation organized a couple of weeks ago. As you know, the main topic was about the Great Mismatch, and this we use that term to describe the current gap between workers and employers' expectations when it comes to work. And we would like to know whether you recognize that there is currently a great mismatch, and if so, what are the main criteria of this mismatch between expectations from workers and employers?
Well, thank you, Denis, for this question. Indeed, I think we are still seeing what is, to some extent, this post-COVID labor market conditions. We moved from the Great Resignation that was an issue that we discussed towards the end of last year into the Great Mismatch. And indeed, I think the evidence that we are collecting suggests that there seems to be some significant changes in the expectation of many workers to some extent post-COVID. I think we have all learned to some extent how to cope with the different measures that were put in place in order to contain the spread of the virus. But post-COVID, I think to some extent expectation of many workers have to some extent changed. In the US, for which we have a very up-to-date information, in April of 22, there were some 11.5 million vacancies in a pool of about 6 million unemployed. So we're talking about more than almost 2 vacancies per job seeker, which is a pretty record high level for the US. And we do observe significant tensions in the labor market in many other OECD countries. But I think the interesting point here is that while the shortage of high-skilled workers is an issue that we know very well. It was there also in the labor market before the pandemic. Where I do observe also shortages is among low-paid type of jobs in the service sectors, but also in other sectors. And the question is why? And I think there are different reasons, different explanations which are emerging from that. One is that those working in these low-paid, sometimes hard working conditions type of jobs are looking for better opportunities. Of course, they were supported during the pandemic to different extraordinary measures. And in the recovery phase, also because there are many new vacancies, people are taking the time to look for somewhat better job opportunity. This is about pay, but actually goes beyond pay. It's actually about working conditions themselves, the number of hours worked. And I think the other interesting point is that there is a very high demand for hybrid form of work. So people do like to have the opportunity to work from home from time to time, and more generally, I would say for more flexibility in working time arrangement. And I think, frankly speaking, during the pandemic, we've all learned that this kind of flexibility can be actually consistent with maintaining, if not actually even improving productivity. So it's something that possibly could be accommodated. Again, some statistics are interesting. Before the pandemic, 96% of US white-collar professional workers were asking for greater flexibility in working time arrangement. Only 50% of them, basically half of them, got this high level of flexibility. So going forward, I think one of the challenges for many employers is actually how to reconcile the reopening of the economy with actually providing more flexibility, but also improving working conditions for those at the lower end of the pay distribution.
That's interesting because it seems that this request for flexibility is now coming more from the workers than from the employers, and the employers to some extent are reluctant to offer this flexibility in terms of working conditions to the workers. One additional question regarding this mismatch, because it seems, especially in the US, that we have seen many people also leaving the labor market, mostly due to early retirement or long time, sickness. Do you also notice this kind of trends in Europe?
Well, indeed, what we have seen, and these are very different patterns when we look at Europe and when we look at other non-European countries. So in Europe, there was some reduction in the labor force participation during the first and early phases, if you like, of the pandemic. In the US, is a more recent phenomenon, something that actually took place in 21, even the last part of 2021. To a very large extent, this decline in labor force participation has been basically reabsorbed. There are still countries that according to the latest statistics for the first quarter of 2022 are still slightly below in terms of labor force participation that was before the pandemic. To some extent, these are actually young people that decide to stay longer in education, so it's also related to that. But I think it's something that gradually has been reabsorbed. But most of the people, at least some of those who really want to change job, are looking for different job opportunities. They're not necessarily going back to the same job they had before. And this, of course, is creating constraints even to the production activities of a number of sectors, a number of companies.
Thank you. Getting back to these current shortages of labor, it seems that this is taking place in most of the countries and the labor markets around the world. A recent survey from the Manpower Group mentioned that 69% of employers around the world are facing difficulty in recruiting. Does that impact the competitiveness of the OECD countries in terms of accessing to the right talent and then being able to provide services or produce products?
Indeed, there is a certain, the fact that we're talking about 26% of firms in both manufacturing and services in Europe basically is already saying that this is actually a major, to some extent, constraint to their production activities. Of course, signal that this is becoming a very serious issue, which has to do with, again, the performance of individual firms, countries, sectors, and also the competitiveness across countries. There is no problem, no question about that. The question is how to basically overcome that. And I think, to some extent, that this may also be associated with some technological transformation within the companies to actually, to some extent, ensure that we can get the best use of workers we have in our companies. But also the big issue, which actually at the title even of the event, about the Great Mismatch. So how do we address the skill mismatch between the company and the worker have? Let's remember that in Europe, we have many people who are seeking for a job, who are unemployed, and yet many companies cannot find suitable workers for their activity. So the issue about reducing, or if not eliminating the skill mismatch, in my view, has to be at the top of the agenda for both governments, but also for the companies and the social partners themselves.
Yeah, this is clearly what we see from the recruitment industry side, of course. Now, the fact that skilling today is a big issue. So we need to skill, reskill, or upskill workers. But it seems also that sometimes, still nowadays, formal qualification is still very much, the way to assess, the relevance of a candidate. And this is something we probably need to move forward or to move away from, indeed, in order to be able to really, develop a skill-based recruitment process to identify the right candidate and to source the right talent. Do you see any role for cooperation between, private employment services and policymakers to overcome such barriers and to make sure that indeed, candidates are being recruited purely on their skills and not on their qualifications or diploma?
I fully agree that then this is one of the major areas where the further progress, actually significant and actually rapid, if possible, progress has to be made. The statistics are pretty clear. If you look at the adult skills survey of the OECD, you're talking about 14% of workers across all OECD countries who are misplaced, in the sense that they have competence and skills who do not actually match very well the job or the requirement of the job they are performing. So the numbers are pretty large. We're talking about a significant fraction of the workers. And I think the challenge going forward is to move from qualifications to actually assessment of skills. That's easy to say, much more difficult to put in practice, because for qualification, we have standards, we have diplomas and so on. For the assessment of skill, of course, it's much more difficult. But that's, I think, is the way to go. We definitely have to try to move towards recruitment on the basis of actual skills and not only, I would say, the qualification workers have. Here I can quote a number of quite interesting examples we have been collecting. For example, one is in Germany with the people and corporate value. This is an initiative that focuses in particular on the small and medium-sized enterprise and provides basically resources and guidance to help companies, small and medium-sized enterprise, who of course have much more difficulties in moving into this skill-based recruitment process, to actually adopt new tools and new ways of identifying the best talent for their own companies. Another example is in Ireland, where there is a joint initiative also with companies, again, which is called SkillNet Ireland. in which actually there are a number of networks of companies put together to again provide this kind of guidance on helping recruiters in companies, again with a focus also on SMEs, to move into this skill-based recruitment process. So there is a lot to be done, but I think also a number of examples of what could be done.
And in order to try to tackle, shortages of labor, would you recognize that the fact that diverse forms of work are being provided in the labor markets can help? And by diverse forms of work, I mean, of course, having open-ended contracts, but also fixed-term contracts, agency work contracts, apprenticeship contracts, part-time contracts. Do you feel that this could be part of the solution to attract more people into the labor market and at the same time, answering the needs from the employers?
I think to some extent, Denis, yes. The answer is definitely yes, because I think the nature of many jobs has changed in a way that I think requires also a different response in terms of even the labor contract that workers and companies, employers actually set up. There is no question about that. There is a more heterogeneity, variation of the type of task, also working arrangement, not only from a timing point of view, but also in terms of, location and so on and so forth. So that's for sure. Something that has to also be reflected into perhaps a different type of contract. On the other end, the fact in some countries, including my own in Italy, there is a plethora of labor contract is also quite confusing. It is confusing for the workers who don't really know what type of contract they are signing, nor for the employer. So I think also some clarity of what each type of contract means, what is the engagement, what are the conditions, and so on and so forth. In my view, it's important. And actually, frankly speaking, in some cases, for example, for some platform work, I think we actually have to recognize that although these are supposed to be independent work or dependent contract, actually there is a degree of economic dependence. So there is also a significant effort that has to be made, in my view, to actually properly classify the work relationship between a company, an employer, and the worker.
No, and fully agree on that one, Stefano. As you know, the World Employment Confederation has been calling indeed for the right classification of the workers when we're working via online talent platform. Maybe a final question, looking at the unemployment rate across the OECD countries. Over the last couple of months, we have seen actually a major decrease of the level of unemployment amongst most of the OECD countries. But at the same time, as said earlier, we are also still seeing quite a high level of inactivity amongst the working population. Do you have any explanation for that? First of all, do you recognize this trend? And if so, do you have any explanation for such a situation?
No, it's a very interesting phenomenon and something we have to see how long it will persist, because I think maybe we are still seeing some of the, to some extent, the effect of the last phases of, hopefully, at least, of the COVID, in which people have saved some resources, they got some subsidies, a temporary subsidy during the COVID crisis, and again, they're looking for better job opportunity. Has to be said that although we have reopened most of our economies, there is still a significant degree of uncertainty. So people working in restaurant, hotel, in tourism, still activities have not fully resumed. But also, to some extent, workers might be a bit more concerned about working in this type of job, unless, to some extent, working conditions are improved and also paid. So there is a big reflection going on. But the other point I want to say is also that we need, as part of the rethinking about policy and institution post-COVID, another big chapter, in my view, is the one of social protection systems. To some extent, in most of the countries, if not all countries, social protection systems are still the one of the 20th century, not the 21st century. They were basically designed, and here I'm generalizing, of course, for the kind of a typical job that was a full-time, open-ended employee type of contract. And we know, as we've been discussing, that now about 40% of workers are not in these standard forms of employment. They are more in non-standard form of employment. And therefore, making sure that social protection covers them, but also ensuring that they have the right incentive to contribute to the system, in my view, is an important part of the package. So yes, of course, policy to promote a quicker transition from one job to the other, but also the basic social protection that has to be adapted to the needs of workers who are actually quite different across the board.
Yeah, as you know, this is something that the agency work industry has been trying to do also over the last, years, if not decades, trying to build new safety nets, especially for agency workers, for temporary workers. But clearly, there's still some work to be done there. Okay, maybe to conclude this interview, looking at all the different trends we have identified and discussed together. What is your view on the cooperation between public and private employment services? Do you feel that today this is working well? This could be better improved? Any need for, I don't know, researching further, any good practices between these two very important, players in the labor market, public and private employment services? Happy to get your views on that, Stefano.
I think that's another chapter in which some progress has been made. Of course, there are huge variations across countries, and in which I can see a significant potential for actually making further progress. I see a lot of potential for good complementarities between what the public employment service can and should be doing and what the private agency can actually do to complement the work of public employment service. Of course, you can go all the way to the Australian model, which are basically subcontracted most of the placement, or the UK model, where actually placement is subcontracted to the private sector for the long-term unemployed. But I think with a number of other experiences in other European countries and otherwise, actually suggest that this complementarity can actually work best for the interests of the worker, the job seeker themselves, but also for the companies. The important thing is to have, in my view, very clear rules of the game, if you like, or very clear contracts on what it is expected from the private agencies. And indeed, making sure that there is a complementarities between what is the role of the public employment services, what is expected from the private agencies. The other point is that, in my view, it doesn't really work if a stop and go kind of system whereby you use the private agency only when you need it, basically when there is a crisis, when unemployment goes up. This kind of contract and relationship has to be established on a regular basis. And maybe then, to the extent to which there is more need, the market extends because there are more job seekers and so on, maybe some of the function can be extended. But these rules of the game, engagement, the guidelines, I think have to be set. And also, again, this complementarity between the two, the public and the private. This is what I think is a key ingredient to make sure this cooperation work for the best of workers and again for the employers as well.
Again, a position that the World Employment Confederation fully supports. As you know, we have been calling for long-term sustainable partnership with the public employment services as much as possible. Well, Stefano, big thank to you. Very insightful views on this changing world of work and indeed the great mismatch. So once again, big thank you for your contribution and see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis, and thank you for having me.